everyone, I'm Denisha. Hi everyone, I'm Denisha Devnarayan, and you're watching the Full Quota podcast on One World Sports Radio.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Full Quota podcast. My name is Mpho, and I'm joined by Tim. This is an interesting edition of the Full Quota podcast. You know, we normally talk cricket, South African cricket, and South Africa is going to start playing their warm-up games for the World Cup soon. But today we thought we'd bring you something a little bit different. We normally bring you interviews, and since we had that interview with Roland Butcher earlier on at the start of our podcast, we thought maybe we get another interesting conversation going around West Indian cricketers and the Rebel tours that happened in South Africa. I wasn't even born when the Rebel tours happened, but they framed so much of the South African cricketing experience and cricketing history. And so Tim managed to get a very interesting guest, and Tim will introduce that guest. But Tim, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, all refreshed and ready for the interview.
Yes. So, Tim, just give us before we even go there, please remember to like and subscribe to our One World Sports Radio channel. We're following the Proteas throughout the World Cup, so please do subscribe and you'll be notified whenever we go live. The Proteas are hoping to slay some demons at this World Cup and hopefully get through. But Tim, can you introduce the guest today? Let us know why you thought we would have this. We bring him on today to have this conversation.
Yeah. So obviously, as Mpho said, we are a South African themed podcast. And this is a feature that I would like to introduce on a more regular basis, but we would need those out there listening to give me your input whether you think it's a good idea. So our guest is Ashley Gray, who's written a book about the West Indian rebel tours that happened in the early 80s. Like Mpho, I wasn't born when they were going on, but the stories of those tours had a huge impact on me, and the fact that we had West Indian players playing in our country for the next 20 years after these tours had a huge impact. I was growing up with the Malcolm Marshalls and the Desmond Haynes of this world playing. So I just thought it was a really good idea to get Ashley Gray on to talk about those tours, to talk about the wider impact on both cricket in the West Indies and in South Africa.
Yes, and so the book is called The Unforgiven, Missionaries and Missionaries or Mercenaries, the tragic story of the rebel West Indian cricketers who toured apartheid South Africa. Without further ado, let's get Ashley Gray on and let's have this conversation. I'm really excited. Hi, Ashley. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yes. Yes, actually, I think for me, these tours have always been interesting, largely from the context of where our country was and the game in which actually South Africa is right now, with a lot of talk about transformation and everything else. But from a perspective of the younger crowd, myself weren't born then, but we know about the rebel tours. There are some who don't. And there were two tours, which is there were actually a lot of tours, but this West Indian tour, can you just give a context around the thinking around the time, around the West Indian rebel tours, and why it was brought forward in a time where South Africa was under sanctions from the international community?
Sure. I think the main thing back then was that there had already been two rebel tours, an English one and a Sri Lankan one. And the English one had gone well enough, except that the England side was filled with it was a bit of a dad's army really team, and it was guys just looking for a superannuation payout, retirement payout. It was Boycott, Alan Knott, a few others like that. I mean, Graham Gooch went, and he suffered a 3-year ban because of it. But it was generally older guys who were past their best, and the excitement of seeing an England team in South Africa soon wore off when it was revealed how easy to beat them it was by the white South African side. And then after that, there was a Sri Lankan side that came in, I think it was in late '82, but they were very substandard, and they got smashed by the Springboks, as they were known back then. And so what you found was that the crowd interest in that Sri Lankan tour diminished really quickly, and I think there was a sense, there was a worry and there was a fear that things couldn't be retrieved in a way because the tour had been so bad, and there was a sense in which maybe South African cricket had lost face with its audience, So Ali Bakr, who was the on the SACU board, and Joe Pomensky, who was a president, wanted a bigger fish. They wanted the best team in the world, and because they knew that would restore any lost faith that the South African cricket public might have had, but also they knew it would give the Springboks a fair tussle out on the pitch, So they knew that it would be good cricket, and that it would revive interest and faith in the game in South Africa. Because obviously, from 1970 onwards, South Africa was in the wilderness, in the Test cricket wilderness, having been banned from playing because of the apartheid policies, which were still persisting into the 80s, obviously. And they tried many times to get the ICC, or the equivalent back then, to let them back into Test cricket, but because of apartheid, they weren't allowed. And that they'd also tried to integrate at various times players of colour into white sides, but it hadn't really worked. And there were two there was the SACU, which was run by Pomensky and Ali Bakr and guys like that. And then there was also the South African Cricket Board, which was sort of run by Indian South Africans. So there were these two competing boards, and the South African Cricket Board didn't want anything to do with rebel tours because they thought that there should be no. They had a slogan: no normal sport in an abnormal society. Mm-hmm. So so that's what you had at the time, and Bakr and Pomensky and South African cricket in general felt that it could die out without international competition. So that was the stimulus for getting rebel teams to tour. They really wanted to incite interest again, because there's only so many Curry Cups with the same guys running around that I suppose crowds could tolerate after a while. So they really feared that cricket in South Africa would die. So you can see that their motives were kind of pure on one hand, but on the other hand, by getting these foreign teams to come into South Africa, they were helping to normalise what was going on in South Africa, helping white people feel that they were living in a normal world, which was obviously completely and utterly wrong and very crass. So, so that's what was going on at the time, and West Indies were the dominant force in world cricket. They were charismatic. They were lethal. Certainly the bowlers were, or at least almost, and their batsmen played with flair, and they were crowd pleasers. Everywhere they went, they were sort of loved and heralded. So if South Africa could lure them to the Republic, to the pariah Republic, it would be a massive coup. So that's kind of what was happening at the time.
And so your book details the lives of these West Indian cricketers after
Yep.
the tour and the fallout that happened in their home countries. Um, you're an Australian, Ashley. So
Yep.
how did you come about to writing this book? Because that's an interesting link because you're on one island on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
other
yeah.
side of the world,
Yeah, what
but
have I got to
you're
do with it? Yeah,
detailing stories of men
yeah,
elsewhere.
yeah, true. Look, I knew about the rebel tours. I remember the Australian rebel tours in the mid '80s were quite controversial here. And even the Prime Minister stepped in and called the Australians who went on those tours traitors, or at least the Foreign Minister did. So they were very. There was a lot of angst about them, and but those guys were only hit with a 3-year ban when they test ban when they went on those rebel tours to South Africa. So how did I get involved? Well, in 2003, I was over in the West Indies just doing some reporting for a local cricket magazine that was run by Kerry Packer, the great Kerry Packer, who instigated World Series cricket.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in Jamaica for a one-dayer at Sabina Park. And after the game, we were in a taxi, and the taxi driver noticed my press pass dangling around my neck. So we started talking about cricket, as you do with taxi drivers. And then he mentioned that there was a Test cricketer just down the road who I could go and talk to if I wanted. And I said, yeah, why not? And he said, he's actually in the gutter, and he lives in the gutter. He lives on the streets, and he's he runs with a gang, and he's addicted to cocaine. And I was like, wow, this is just crazy. I mean, it wouldn't happen in Australia that an ex-Test cricketer would just be living on the streets, and in full view of the public. So I was like, wow, okay, yeah, take me there. And exactly as the guy said, he was Richard Austin in the gutter, supping rum from a plastic Coke bottle, and with about 6 other guys who were quite big and threatening, actually. And that they wanted money for me to speak to him. So I gave them the equivalent of 30 Australian dollars, which is a fair bit in Jamaican money. So they wanted that money to go and buy drugs, basically. So so they sort of went off and left with Richard, and we got to talking. And Richard was a really entertaining guy. I really liked his company. He's very funny. He had a great sense of humour. Early on we were talking, he said he wanted to. He was 48 years old at this point in time. His eyes were bloodshot. He was. He looked bedraggled. He didn't look in good shape at all. But he said to me, and he was serious. But then I thought, well, maybe he was joking as well. He said, "Could you give Kerry Packer a call? This is the richest man in Australia, one of the richest men in the world." He said, "My good friend Kerry Packer." That's what he said. My good friend Kerry Packer, and I will, and I'll come over to New South Wales and coach and play for New South Wales in the Sheffield Shield. As I said, he was 48 years old, a man with a cocaine habit, living on the streets, who hadn't played cricket in some time. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of the sense of humour he had, I suppose. And we got to talking as to why he was on the streets, and he said he was there he just said 2 words, South Africa, and that was it. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I went on the first rebel tour of South Africa in 1983, early 83, and got paid a lot of money for it. But when I came back to Jamaica, no one wanted to speak to me because they thought I'd taken blood money, that I'd betrayed my fellow countrymen in order to make some money at the expense of people of the same colour skin as me in South Africa. So yeah, he was ostracised from that moment on, he says, and he said, and his life fell apart. Even though he'd earned lots of money in that tour, and even though he actually had a house to go to, he was so filled with shame and a sense of self-pity, I suppose, that he preferred to live on the street, and obviously he also had a cocaine habit to facilitate as well. So yeah, it was quite a sad state of affairs. So I wrote a story on that, and I knew then that there must have been a bigger story, because he was just one of 20 guys that went on those 2 tours. It was in the back of my mind to flesh that out one day, and just over the last 6 or 7 years, I had more time to devote to thinking about it. And then when Richard died in 2015, pretty much just died because of the effects of living on the street, and he ended up with a hernia, and it wasn't diagnosed because he didn't go get medical treatment. Then when he did, it was too late, and so it was very sad. So I wrote an obituary for him, and then that sort of re-sparked my interest in the rebels, and then I submitted a book proposal, and that was accepted by Pitch Publishing in England, and from that moment on, I got stuck into writing the book and finding out about the other guys who went on it, and he was just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's just so many different stories that so many tragic ones, but not all tragic. Some guy within any group of 20 men, you're always going to find some that are more sensitive to others, and then some who will just cop things on the chin and get on with it. So it was it's been an interesting it was an interesting challenge to find the guys and reveal their stories. I mean, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted them to take their place in cricket history, regardless of whether what they did was right or wrong. It was just more that they deserve to have their story told. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Feel free to interrupt me at any time.
No, that's good. That's good. That was really good. Yeah, and I've heard and read read your part in the book about Richard Austin. That's terribly sad. But as you point out, there are other stories where they're actually doing all right. The likes of Lawrence Rowe and trying to think now. Just there are a few guys that are done quite. Colin Croft, of course. Colin Croft.
Yeah.
Just talk about the challenge of getting hold of all these 20 individuals, because that wasn't all that easy. You couldn't just pick up a phone and just go, I want to get all 20 together and have a chat.
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't easy at all. I had to. I mean, the first guy I contacted was a guy called Ray Winter, and he was probably the most unsung and unheralded of all the rebels. He came over and played one test in the first tour. He's sort of a fast bowler with a slingshot action, who had a reputation for causing a lot of blood on the wicket in Jamaica. But he hadn't played that many games for Jamaica in the Shell Shield. So I thought it would just be interesting to see whether I could contact the least known of the rebels, just as a sort of challenge first up. So I Googled, and then I Facebooked messaged the Kingston Cricket Club, and about a week later I got a message from them, and this young guy who plays for them, said that he only checks Facebook once every 2 months, and he just happened to notice that there was a message there. So he got in contact with me, and he said, "Yeah, I know Ray. I can get you in contact with him." And so he gave me a phone number, and then they gave me a number of a woman who lived down the street from Herbert Chang, who's the left-handed batsman of Chinese descent, who played who came over as a replacement later on in the first tour, the first Rebel tour, but who after the tours had a mental breakdown and ended up in really sort of straitened circumstances. So Facebook sort of helped me in that way. And when I contacted Ray, he was I could tell in his voice. He's got a very deep voice. He just kept on going, all right, all right, all right. And I just thought that's one too many all rights, because he obviously wasn't convinced that I was the real deal, And I said, look, I'm going to come over there and I'm going to come and see you. And if you don't mind, So we had it. We talked and talked, and he told me stuff, and I said, "Look, I'm going to come over and I'll see you, and we'll meet up." And then when I actually met him, he was great, and he took me around. He took me to Kensington Oval, the home of Lawrence Rowe and Richard Austin and Basil Williams and Herbert Chang and Wavell Hines, guys like that. So I convinced him. But what also worked for me, guys, was, as I say, Facebook. In that, when I got to the Caribbean, or actually the Caribbean and the US, I did them both together because a lot of guys who decamped to the US from the Caribbean after the tours to escape the hostility of their countrymen at the time. What I would do is when I interviewed one of the guys, I'd post it on Facebook and share that around. And a lot, some of the rebels have Facebook accounts, and I'd friend them, and then that would come up on their feed, and then they'd see that, wow, I'd spoken to Lawrence Rowe. He must be the real deal. He's not bullshitting. So that's how it sort of gained momentum. Using social media in that way to show that I wasn't just some charlatan from a place in the world that didn't really have anything to do with them. Which on the surface, I can imagine how that would have seemed. Here I was, this white guy in Sydney wanting to tell their stories. I mean, what was my motive? They could only have thought, I suppose, sinister things in the beginning. But all I really wanted to do was tell the story, a story that I thought I had a unique insight into, because I was one of the only people that had written about Richard Austin. So and I'd seen him, and that just gave me an in that no other journalist had. So I thought, well, yeah, let's go with it.
And with obviously the players that you interviewed and their lives,
yep,
there were bans for people who
yep.
participated in the Rebel tours. The West Indian ban was a lot longer than everybody else's.
It was live,
but
yeah.
Yes, and also the contrast of how they were received in South Africa compared to how they were received at home. I know your book goes through that, but
yep.
How, can you just
yep.
take us through the differences? Because
Sure.
I was just astonished to find out that some guys got slaps on the wrist, the English and the Australians, while other guys' lives just were turned around. And then when they went on tour, it felt like nothing was wrong.
Yeah. Well, being in South Africa, it was like they were in a 5-star bubble. These guys. I mean, they were fated as kings, and they were seen as courageous because they'd broken this sort of the Glen Eagles Agreement, which forbade sporting contact between Commonwealth countries and South Africa. So the courage that they had shown to do that in the eyes of white South Africa was phenomenal, and they really wanted to reward them by showing them a good time and letting them have a good time. So they were able to do things that an ordinary person of color in South Africa wasn't able to do. They were able to fraternize with white women, which apparently they did to quite a degree. They were able to go to bars, nightclubs. They could go to beaches that were off limits to people of color in South Africa. So they were they were loved by the white population in South Africa. And I think in some ways you could make a small argument that maybe they did help liberate white eyes in a way, because they showed here they were, these great black cricketers. They came to South Africa. They beat the best of white South Africa, and they showed white South Africa that black people could participate at the highest levels in sport, and beat them, and also behave with dignity, and be entertaining, and be everything that they hadn't experienced with black people in South Africa up to that point. Because for most white people, black people in South Africa were miners, or doing manual labor jobs, or they were maids, and because of apartheid. So here they were seeing South Africans, seeing West Indian players of African descent, playing so well, and showing that they were the equal, and if not better than white South Africa. So that was pretty amazing. And I've got this magazine here called Calypso Cavaliers, which is that celebrates it's a story of the 1983 tour. And I'll just read you the first paragraph of that. And it says, it's a big publication. It's about 70 pages, lots of color pictures in there, and sort of review of the tour. And it just says, this publication, this is the foreword by the editor Brian Crowley. It says, this publication is offered as a tribute to those who have worked so long and so hard for the benefit of all South Africa's cricketers, whose foresight and fortitude made the dream come true. Mr. Joe Pomensky, Dr. Ali Bakker, and your many helpers, Mr. Padmore, it's Albert Padmore, Mr. Gregory Armstrong, Mr. Lawrence Rowe, and the members of your fine team of Calypso cricketers. I salute you. I mean, that was the sort of tone of what it was like. The newspapers, which were universally in black and white, black and white, black print back then, black on white, had coloured wraparounds, celebrating the next Test match at Johannesburg or wherever. Even from the book, I'll just read you one little bit here. Even rugby-loving Afrikaners got into it, and there's this quote here that I got from the Rand Daily Mail newspaper, and it says, the Vicksburg Afrikaans Sakakama, a regional business association, sent 200 Rand to the SACU to convey our heartfelt thanks and appreciation to your board and to the West Indies cricketers for what they've done for sport in South Africa. So it was just phenomenal, the amount of interest they generated amongst the white public. But at the same time, the black public in South Africa, that they weren't really interested in it at all. And I saw, like the Rand Daily Mail had a township edition and also a regular edition. And in that township edition, there was virtually no coverage at all of the cricket. So it's often been made in hindsight the point that these West Indian tours, were inspirational for young black people in sort of ghetto areas, and they looked up to and idolized them. But as far as I can tell, they didn't know much about what was really going on at all. It wasn't covered. It was just really a white preoccupation, and so that's what was happening there. In in the Caribbean, it was you see, up until like post-independence, like most of the big Caribbean countries got independence in the early 60s, and so in the United Nations, they would regularly get up, like Prime Minister of Jamaica, Manley. He would. Michael Manley. He would get up in the UN and talk about sanctions against South Africa, but he wanted a land, sea, and air boycott of South Africa. He didn't just want economic sanctions, because as he wrote, he said that apartheid points like a dagger at the throat of black people all around the world. So, there were across the Caribbean, there was this current of thought, and justifiably so, that apartheid was a scourge that had to be eradicated, that was a blight on humanity. And that was the feeling in the Caribbean, certainly amongst the political class and everyone who knew about it. And in 1981, the test match in Guyana between England and the West Indies was cancelled because Robin Jackman, who had ties with South Africa, was selected to play, and that Guyana would not tolerate that. So, so that was the atmosphere that was of anti-apartheid resentment, and as I said, justifiably so in the Caribbean at that point in time. So for these guys, these rebels, to go to South Africa, they not only had to break the Glen Eagles agreement, they also had to sort of betray, in a way, the faith that was put in them by the public who loved them, But by the same token, there were also people in the Caribbean, many who thought that these guys had a right to earn a living and to make money, because the Caribbean is almost third world in its poverty, and that they felt that he was a ticket out of poverty for these guys. So they had a lot of support on the ground. The man in the street was very much in favour of them going. But when you got to the educated middle classes and the political class and the clergy and people like that, there was there was outrage. That they would even consider doing this. That that they would betray their own the color of their skin, really, in order to make a lot of money, at the expense of their black South African brothers. So there was a real current of hostility towards apartheid in the Caribbean, and these guys would have to contend with that when they came back.
Yeah, it seems...
Just on that, the fact that they were treated in their homeland in that particular fashion and fated here in South Africa.
Yep.
8 of them went on to play domestic cricket in South Africa after that. Do you think that those rebel tours had an influence? Did they speak about their decision to come back to South Africa and play for the provincial sides?
Sure. Well, for a lot of them, it was the only chance they had to play, because they were banned from all first-class cricket in the West Indies, and they were banned from Test cricket for life. So South Africa was a lifeline for them, professionally speaking. They could still play in England, but the offers weren't coming through in the same way they were before they went on the tours. South Africa was a lifeline, but also it kept the standard. This is what has been said to me by a few of the white South African cricketers from that era. They've said that by having Sylvester Clarke and Collis King and Alvin Calitran and Franklin Stevenson and Emerson Trotman and all those guys playing in South Africa, it kept the standard high, because when the West Indies rebels came out, they taught the Springboks a lesson. That they just weren't prepared for that kind of hostility in terms of fast bowling from the likes of Clarke and Ezra Mosley and Hartley Elaine. That they'd never experienced anything like it. So they were really sort of shocked, and they had to step up a level in order to be able to combat that kind of pace. And so to have those guys continue on there kept the standard up. you know, and helped keep the game alive. Obviously, there were more tours as well. Like the Australians came, as I said, for 2 years as well. But yeah, Alvin Calataran is, you know, he certainly played a lot of cricket there as well, and he was one of the greats of West Indian cricket. Lawrence Rowe didn't come back though. I think he'd had enough, you know, because he was vilified when he went back to Jamaica because he was the captain, you know, but he was also feted as a national hero prior to going because he'd scored 314 runs for once out in his first Test match. I mean, it still hasn't been beaten. It's still a record in Test cricket. And then a triple century like 2 years later. I mean, he was averaging 70 at, you know, when he was age 26 or something. You know, he was a fantastic player whose career sort of slid downhill a little because of eyesight and allergy problems that he had. But yeah, when he went back to Jamaica, you know, he said there'd been death threats. You know, he ran a sports shop with Michael Holding and Basil Shotgun Williams, the Jamaican opening batsman. Yeah, and you know, his kids were copying it at school. You know, it was a difficult time. So he moved to Miami. You know, and yeah, he's still, you know, he's still peeved by the treatment that he got, and even to this day, I'll tell you a little story. It's very contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, at Sabina Park, the wall that runs along Sabina Park, there's a mural that's gone up of 20 of Jamaica's greatest cricketers, and you've got guys like Holding, you know, Courtney Walsh, George Headley, and you've got lesser lights like Morris Foster, you know, who still played Test cricket. And then you've got Marlon Tucker, who never played Test cricket. There are a couple of women there. I think there's a guy who's played unsighted cricket for the West Indies as well. His mural's up there. But there's no sign of Lawrence Rowe, and that's because he went on the Rebel tours. So he's still being excluded, you know, or you know, whitewashed from you know, Jamaican life, I suppose, you know.
There's a story,
and that's today, yeah.
There's a story around the Lawrence Rowe. I think in 2015, he had a stand named after him at Sabina Park, and he apologized for the for the Rebel tours, but it was taken down a couple of months later, largely because of the comments he made even after that, where he kind of mentioned, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they didn't see anything wrong with going on the Rebel tour. And that leads me to my question. The characteristics of these players, right? They played Test cricket. Weren't they earning enough, or had they just gone past, as you mentioned, the other Rebel tours had dad's armies, you know, because there were others in that time who refused to go. So what was the thinking behind these 20? And didn't they know that the backlash could have happened?
Yeah, they did know, yes, but not to that extent. I don't think they thought it would happen to that extent, to that extreme, that they'd be banned for life. They thought maybe they'd get 2 or 3 year bans like the English guys did. You know? That's what they thought. But, you know, there was obviously the color of their skin and what they were doing and what it meant to their people back home added an extra layer of sort of culpability, I suppose, in the eyes of you know, the Caribbean. Yeah, I think that in the case of most of them, they were coming to the ends of their careers. They were also they hadn't made a lot of money from cricket. They had coaching jobs, mainly with the government in some cases. I mean, Lawrence Rowe had probably done better because, as I said, he was feted as a national hero, and you know, he had various sponsorships, and he was sort of sought after. A guy who could, who you wanted to be associated with, who companies wanted to be associated with in Jamaica, especially. But whereas these other guys, they were fringe players who couldn't make it into the West Indies side. The West Indies side was so dominant, that they had enough left over to make another world-beating side, and that was proven by the fact that these guys, who were essentially a second 11, went to South Africa and beat the best that South Africa could offer. So here you have these fantastic players. Like Sylvester Clarke was probably the most feared bowler in county cricket, but he couldn't make it into the West Indies side. Well, he did for 11 tests or so. But Malcolm Marshall was in his way, and Michael Holding, and Andy Roberts, and Joel Garner, and Colin Croft. Some of the greatest bowlers in the history of cricket. So they saw this as a chance to make some money. Coming from such poor backgrounds. There's a guy from Jamaica, Everton Matters, who I met in upstate New York, Poughkeepsie. He came from Jamaica, and he had to escape to New York because he said the police were hassling when he came back to Kingston after the rebel tours. Elegant right-handed batsman. And he said to me that he went on the tours because he was just so poor. He'd grown up in a ghetto where there were sort of warring factions. Every day within the ghetto, like these dons were sort of commanding sort of one ghetto army against another, and here he was, his family in the middle, and he was copying this every day of his life, and this is what he'd grown up in, and here was a chance to earn $100,000 for a couple of weeks' work. It was like, wow, what would you do in those situations? And I think that's what I've tried to ask in the book is put people into that sort of same set of circumstances and ask them what they would do, because he was being offered 80 times more than what your average Jamaican would expect to earn in a year. So that's a lot of damn money, and that would set him up for life, obviously the money was a massive factor for these guys, and you can understand it, considering the poverty that they came from.
Yes, it wasn't just loose change. It was a considerable amount of money.
Essentially,
incredible amount. On the tour itself, and on the players that the South African Cricket Union tried to get. They tried to get. You mentioned there Malcolm Marshall, and I think Desmond Haynes.
Yep.
They became household names in South African cricket afterwards. But that was quite a close call with those two. What happened with that? I know there's a story behind that.
Yeah, they were in Melbourne at the time playing sub-district cricket there. And Malcolm Marshall hadn't quite established himself in the West Indies side. Desmond Haynes had recently done so. He was Gordon Greenidge's partner at that point. But they were both young guys, early 20s. And as I said, Malcolm Marshall hadn't been anointed as Andy Roberts' successor yet in the sort of fearsome, foursome pace attack of West Indies cricket that was happening at that point. Yes, they were contacted by Ali Bakar, and apparently there were tickets at the travel agent in Melbourne that Bakar had paid for, and they were already there for them to pick up, and they were going to pick them up. And David Murray, who knew them both, who was in Adelaide at the time playing grade cricket there, he was meant to meet them in Perth on the flight to South Africa. And he got there, and they hadn't shown up, because apparently they both had chats with Mr. Walcott from the BCA, the Barbados Cricket Association, who assured them that they had a bright future in the game for the West Indies and that they'd be taken care of financially in some respect. Obviously not to the same degree that it would be by going on rebel tours. So they didn't tour, but there were reports in newspapers, in the Australian newspapers from the time, that they're actually going. I mean, that's how close it was. And I think with Malcolm Marshall, he was very canny. He showed the same kind of canniness that he used to show on the pitch when he was bowling. He played a waiting game, and he saw that Colin Croft, who was one of the fearsome pace battery, was on the brink of signing, and he knew that if Colin Croft signed, there'd be a position opening up in that. It's one of those one of that quartet.
The fearsome foursome.
Yes, and the fearsome foursome. Yes, so he sort of played a waiting game, and toyed around with Ali Bakr, and seemingly gave his assent to the whole idea. And then when he found out that Croft wasn't going, he said no. That's one version of history anyway. But I think it kind of stacks up. Marshall could see that there was an opportunity for him now that if Croft was going, he could seize that spot in the West Indies side.
Wow, that's actually quite fascinating. Making use of potential bans to try.
To advantage. Yeah, I mean, it all sounds rather. I don't know. Yeah,
look, it's pretty clever.
It's clever.
It shows of a man who understood the situation, had a lot of foresight, and
understood the wider.
As people around him who gave him proper advice, which a lot of the guys in the 20 didn't necessarily have.
Yeah, exactly.
And look, that money was a lot. $100,000 right now is still a lot of money today. So imagine what it was back in those days,
especially in the Caribbean. Yep.
Yes, that's true.
Yep.
My final question around all of this was how there were two tours, the first tour and the second one. How did they end up still getting the second tour even after, or was the backlash largely out of tour number 2? And did you ask any of the cricketers why they went back?
Well, they were contracted for 2 tours initially, and the first, I mean, there was a lot of resentment from the Caribbean during the first tour, more so because it was the first one. It was sort of out of the blue a bit, and no one thought that it could happen. So by the second tour, it had probably died down a bit, the hostility, because they'd already done it. They'd already broken the ban on contact with South Africa. It wasn't such a novelty, and that was probably one of the reasons why the second tour. I mean, there was still a lot of interest, but things went sour at one point over sponsorship deals, and the one days were wonderfully attended, but towards the end, some of the tests, they weren't getting quite the crowds that they got, during the first tour. So they were contracted for 2 tours, and I actually heard from Gregory Armstrong, who was the tour manager. He said to me that they were initially going to do 5 tours.
Wow.
Yeah, because it had all gone so well, but during the second tour, the squabbling over sponsorship money sort of cruelled that idea, I think. But even the next season, I read in South African newspapers from the time that there was talk of doing like a triangular series where they would invite West Indies rebels, Australian rebels, and have a 3-way contest with South Africa, one days and possibly tests as well over the coming seasons. But obviously that didn't happen. But there were lots of ideas at the time, but that came from the horse's mouth. Gregory Armstrong, he said, there were going to be five West Indies tours because it had been such a success, and they were so. You see the footage and you see they're just queues of guys, just queues of young boys wanting autographs and pieces of clothing or anything, equipment from the likes of Collis King, who was a massive hit in South Africa. He was, I think the newspapers dubbed him Cool Breeze because he could just go out there quite flamboyantly and score, a century off, virtually no balls, and then, take a couple of wickets or a spectacular catch. He sort of embodied what people in South Africa thought was calypso cricket. So these guys were lauded. They, they were treated like kings in South Africa. Yeah.
I've just got a couple more.
Yep.
So obviously, there'll be South Africans listening in here of a certain generation who will have been there, seen the tours. Did you speak to any of the South African players that were involved, the Graham Pollocks of this world, the Rupert Handleys? I know you spoke to him. What was their perception of the tour? And then, how was your book received? How is your book being received in the Caribbean?
Okay. Yeah. The South African guys, well, they thought it was fantastic that the West Indies came out to play, but they were so hungry for international competition, especially Barry Richards. I mean, he was 35 or 36, and he was thinking of hanging up the bat, but the thought of testing himself against the West Indies was enough to lure him away from retirement. And so he practiced. He told me he practiced day in, day out with a bowling machine cranked up to 100 miles an hour in anticipation of facing Sylvester Clarke and Colin Croft. He was particularly thrilled by the idea, but ultimately, he did okay. He actually retired after the first tour, and he acquitted himself well. But he did say to me as well that he felt like, not so much that ended his career, just more that he realised that compared to 10 years before, he didn't quite have the reflexes that he had, and you really needed to have quick reflexes in order to be able to combat those guys. So it kind of exposed to him that, maybe he wasn't quite the player that he was. Graham Pollock, I spoke to him. Yeah, he also thought it was fantastic. I mean, he got felled by a Hartley Lane bouncer in the second tour. And he sort of dropped like a sack of spuds on the pitch, and it was really. You can actually see it on YouTube if you want to Google it. But he said that it was a great challenge, and he was still able to score freely, and he played on for another 2 years against the Australians as well, and scoring double centuries. So. It certainly kept his career alive. Rupert Spook Handley. I think he took a hat trick in the second tour against the West Indies in a one day. He told me that he thought the tours were. They all said that that they despised apartheid and that they thought it was crazy, but they just thought that this was all they had, and this was the best they could do at the time. And well, we did it, and it kept South African cricket alive in their eyes. So it was so they tend to think it was a good thing that the rebel tours happened, these were guys like Barry Richards and Pollock, they'd taken part in a walk-off in 1971. I think it was Transvaal were playing the rest of South Africa in a game, in a first-class match, and they walked off after the first ball as a protest against apartheid. And this is, Pollock and Richards and Proctor, and I think Transvaal were led by a guy called Donald Mackay Coghill, who I just spoken to recently, in fact, and he said that that they wanted to be able to play with black guys. They wanted to be able to play with people of color, but they weren't allowed to, and this was a protest against that. So you can see that even going back to then, that these guys, they were in an unfortunate situation. They weren't. They didn't like apartheid, but they were professional cricketers and they wanted to play. So they certainly enjoyed the series. It was good for them. Yeah. What was the second part of your question, Tim?
Sorry. How is your book being received in the Caribbean? Did you get any pushback? Yeah.
It's been mostly well received. I mean, there have been one or two people who thought that. Well, actually, there's just one person who thought that I was taking advantage of the guys. Little do they know how small the percentages that you make from each book. Yeah, I've barely broken even. In fact, yeah. So in Jamaica, there's been a little bit of there's a big story in the Jamaica Gleaner and Observer about the book, and but what I found was that there was still a sentiment there that these guys should remain unforgiven, that they shouldn't be forgiven. This is what the book had sort of has revealed there, and this was the tone of the writing there, about the book. In Barbados, there's interest, but then at times there, I mean, the reaction in Barbados wasn't as extreme as in Jamaica to the rebels. There was a bit more of a laissez-faire sort of attitude, in that that they felt that the rebels had a right to make money as professional cricketers. But the government's policy was very much anti-apartheid, and they were very much upset by the rebels going there. So there has been a reluctance to talk about it that I've noticed, from the media there. They want to talk to you, and then all of a sudden they'll pull out at the last moment. They won't do the interview, or there'll be some sort of feeble excuse sort of made up. Trinidad was interesting. There was only one rebel from Trinidad, Bernard Julian, who was a dashing, handsome all-rounder. But yeah, I did quite a bit of media there, and the feeling there was, I think, that about the book was, first up, like you guys said, what the hell are you doing writing a book like this? You're in Australia, you're a white guy from Sydney. What the hell's going on? And then in the same breath, it was Fazir Muhammad, who's an excellent cricket commentator there. Yeah. And he said to me, it does seem strange, but he said, but by the same token, that often history is viewed best by people who are outside the culture, because they have a broader perspective and they're not held down by the same biases and prejudices that people within are. So he said that it was a good thing, and that he said that there's a reluctance in the Caribbean to tell difficult stories and controversial stories, and there's a tendency to sweep them under the carpet. So from his perspective, it's a good thing that the book has happened. And I mean, and that kind of gels with my idea about the book, in that you can't sweep things under the carpet. You've got to tell the stories of these guys, because there's so many different perspectives and ways in which the stories of these guys play out. It's political, it's social, it's economic, it's racial, it's sport. It's all these things interlinked, and they the consequence of one decision that these guys made in a lot of cases, in their mid-20s, absolutely scarred them for life. So there's that aspect of it as well. The sort of decisions we make, and the price you sometimes pay inadvertently when you're not when you don't think that the worst is going to happen, but ultimately it does in some cases. Yeah.
So Ashley, I think we've reached the end of our interview.
No worries.
For those who are wanting to grab a hold of the book, is there a link for the book, or a website they can go to order it?
Yeah, you can get it from Amazon, I'm pretty sure. You can get it from Pitch Publishing in the UK. It's pretty easy to Google and find. So it's The Unforgiven, Missionaries or Mercenaries, and it's by Pitch Publishing. So if you key those in, you'll find it in lots of different bookstores. I think Waterstones in the UK has got it. I mean, it's in lots of Australian bookshops as well. So it's all around, and hopefully all your listeners will buy one plus one for their friends as well, and more.
They certainly should. Yeah. They certainly should, because it's an excellent book.
Yes, they should. Yes, and that's from Ashley Gray. Buy one plus one. But so from a South African perspective, it's also available in exclusive books, and you can go and have a look there. You can search for Ashley Gray, and you'll find it there, The Unforgiven. Ashley, thank you very much for having this conversation with us. This is truly enriching, because the stories of those men has never been documented. It's always been, there was a rebel tour, these people came, and in South Africa, as a black person, I never really liked them. I thought that they were foolish to do this, but you've given you've added color to everything, and most definitely a read for any black South African, or any South African who wants to get the other side of the story, and how it is, because we all, and as many people have said around apartheid, we were all sheltered in some different way, and we didn't see different sides of the story. So these men were really, they did something, and and I think the reader will decide whether they should be forgiven or not.
Exactly.
But I do think that's where the conversation will ultimately lead. But thank you very much, Ashley, again. All the best with the book sales. It was the Wisdom Book of the Year last year, so that's something.
Yes, and recently it was the British Cricket Book of the Year as well, I think.
Oh, okay. So there you have it, British Cricket Book of the Year and the Wisdom Cricket Book of the Year. So do go out and get it. Thank you very much, Ashley.
I was just going to say, I could talk to you about the book for another hour, but we're all time limited here.
No worries.
Thanks, Tim. Just wanted to concur with Mpho. Thanks very much for coming on and giving your side of the book. It's been a great listen.
Thanks. It's a pleasure. And as Mpho was saying, it's just good to get the guys' stories out there, and ultimately the reader will make a judgment, I suppose. And I hope the book just allows the reader to empathize more with the decision they made, these guys. Not so much to go, well, they made the right decision, but just to see that they were just human beings, just doing what they did, and there were a lot of mitigating factors. It wasn't just a case of take the money and run. There were a lot of other things going on in their lives at the time, and they were feverish times back then, as we know. Yeah. Yes, anyway, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Yes. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tim, thank you very much for that. That was lovely. Slightly longer, but I think you will be grabbed in the listener and the viewer will be grabbed in the first couple of minutes because the stories of these men are just incredible and they need to be told. And I'm really happy that you brought this through. So, yeah.
I think that's exactly it. That's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to just give a viewpoint, a background story of those tours, and it was really good that Ashley could do that, and he does do that throughout the book. It's you do have sympathy. You still think that what happened was wrong, but you have a lot more sympathy for those that did the tour. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Anyone's listening, I hope you enjoyed it. I do think the fact that it was longer was worth it. If anyone out there would like this to continue, I could get more South African cricket authors on because we are a South African podcast. So there are lots of South African writers who've written cricket books, present and past. So I would just like to know whether you guys are interested in that. That'd be good to know.
Well, I'm definitely most interested. So, Tim, I'm going to tell you from here: go forth and conquer, and go do that. You always bring the most incredible guests to the show. So, thank you very much. Remember, that's the end of our show. We'll be back next week to discuss the CSA T20 knockout quarterfinals. So please do watch out for that. Outside of that, you can interact with us on our various platforms, YouTube, Twitter, and as well as Facebook. Please also like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to Ashley as well for coming on. From myself, Mpho, and Tim, goodbye. Have a great day, and lesale kakakis.